Good evening, everyone. I'm Jeanette Brizendine from the City of Federal Way Recycling, and I'm super excited to announce tonight's Making Pickles at Home class. The City of Federal Way is putting on this class because food waste prevention is very important. Almost 40% of the food that is grown in this country goes to waste, and that's a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, as well as just a wasted resource. So one of the things we're hoping to do with our food preservation series is to teach people how to preserve your food so you're not throwing it away. So when you have a bountiful garden or you're getting food from the farmer's market, so that you're able to preserve this and have it year round. So next slide, please. I'd like to thank our sponsors. So the City of Federal Way is putting this on in collaboration with the South King Tool Library, and we're using grant funding from the King County Department of Natural Resources Solid Waste Division and from the Hazardous Waste Management Program in King County. So we very much thank them for these classes and everything that comes along with them. Next slide, please. As I said, my name is Jeanette Brizendine. My contact information is here on the screen. I also put it in the chat. This has my cell phone, so you can call or text me, you can email me. And then we also have our Facebook link and Instagram and YouTube. So please reach out if you need anything, and we will be posting this and all the resources in those. Next, I'd like to turn it over to my wonderful co-host, Amanda Miller from the South King Tool Library. Next slide.
Hey, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us. So excited to see you all, meet you all. If you haven't heard about the Tool Library, really glad I could be part of this evening, but want to get the word out there about how we lend tools to reduce waste, reduce consumption, offer these partnership training experiences, and try to empower folks to make the changes they want to see in the community and the world. So you know, the small goal is making the world a better place, one tool at a time. And those tools do also include some food preservation tools. And I'm really excited about our vacuum sealers. I think I want to highlight those this week because they're just amazing assets to make your purchases or your food just stretch even longer. So I will not take up any more of your time. If you have any questions about the Tool Library, please feel free to message me directly. My contact information is on your screen, and you'll probably have it included in a follow-up email. So I look forward to seeing you all soon. And Carrie, oh, and this is the edible rain garden in the back of our amazing building here in Federal Way. And we're probably going to have to do some food preservation on some of the goodies coming out of there. So lots of herbs and onions and all kinds of fun things. So if you get a chance, come on over, pull some weeds. I'll show you all the edible weeds and other goodies in the rain garden. Thanks, Carrie.
All right. Hi, my name is Carrie, and I work with Can y'all hear me? Okay. Okay, great. Sorry. My name is Carrie, and I am teaching the class about making pickles. I grew up eating pickles, and I love to eat pickles, and I do preservation in a lot of ways. But this class, I thought it was fun to talk just a little bit about the different ways of making pickles. And so I work with an organization called Tilth Alliance. I am based in Seattle, but the organization that I work for does work in all around King County, and even does some work statewide. And the work that I do usually is teaching adults classes either online or in person, less in person during the pandemic, but really around gardening and permaculture, composting, and also a lot of food preservation classes. And so, yeah, so what I thought that I would do tonight is I've got a sort of a quick slideshow. It's maybe just about 6 or 7 slides, but I also I was going to do a little bit of a demo too. So I'll make some quick refrigerator pickles. It's a recipe that is in, so the handout, when you register for the class, the handout that Jeanette sent you, on the second page of it, there is just kind of a, it's more of a method than a recipe of making these really quick fridge pickles, and it's super easy. So I'll do a little demo at the end of class, and then I'm hopefully going to leave a lot of time to answer questions because I feel like folks will have a lot of questions.
Do you have freeze dryer machines?
I'm sorry?
Do you have freeze drying machines?
Oh, at the tool library,
Mhm.
I think there is a freeze drying machine, and there
Cool.
will be a class coming up in a couple weeks, maybe.
On June 10th, we'll have a class on freeze drying and dehydrating. And there's one freeze dryer that can be checked out and 3 dehydrators that can be checked out from the tool library.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start maybe just kind of with a broader look at how we preserve foods. And I think I like, whenever I talk about food preservation, whether it's canning or drying or even putting things in the freezer, I think I like to think of sort of this broad and share this broader view of why we preserve foods. I think that when we talk about food waste prevention, it's really important to just kind of think about what we're trying to do when we either pick a fresh food from our garden or bring home fresh food from the grocery store, and think about how we're trying to keep it usable for as long as possible. A lot of us do food preservation at home every day without even thinking about it. When we bring our groceries home from the grocery store and put them in the refrigerator or put them in the freezer, if it's a frozen food product, we're already doing food preservation. And there's lots of other ways to do it. A couple weeks ago, we did a class about basic canning. There also is drying. As a gentleman mentioned before, freeze drying is now a new technology that we have that we're able to do at home if we have access to the tool library. And other sort of traditional ways of preserving food for the longer term would be things like smoking. Drying is a very traditional food preservation technique. Salting, curing, fermentation is also a very traditional food technique. And then there's a couple of different ways of doing canning. And when we talk a little, as we talk about pickles, there are kind of several different ways of making pickles. And so it'll come back to this list because there are ways to make pickles through fermentation. There are ways to make pickles using canning as a technology. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. I also like to share a little bit about what microbes need to live, because basically what we're doing with food preservation is we're taking a fresh food and we're trying to keep it usable for as long as possible. And sometimes what that means is we're manipulating that food item or using different control factors. And what those control factors are, for example, microbes need food to live. Obviously, they want the food, we want the food. Sometimes with the example of fermentation, we're actually creating conditions for very specific microbes to be successful. Like if we're, making wine, or if we're making beer, turning grapes into wine for longer preservation, we are encouraging yeast to grow. And so we're creating conditions for them. Sometimes we don't want the bacteria or the yeast to grow, and so we're going to try to kill or control those using things like acidity. pH can be a control factor for us because some bacteria microbes like acidic environments and some do not. So a lot of pathogenic bacteria don't like acidic environments, and that's where making something like pickles has been, a traditional way of preserving fresh vegetables, because we're creating a very acidic environment, and it's going to keep a lot of pathogenic bacteria and molds and yeast from growing and taking our food away from us and making it go bad so we can't eat it. Time is also a control factor. So when we're doing something like fermentation, that bacteria is going to grow over time. Temperature is another way that we kind of control, is a control factor for us. When we're doing fermentation, the ambient temperature is going to make a lot of difference. If we think about something like canning, where we want to stop all microbial growth, we're actually heat processing. So we're taking something up to a high temperature to kill off bacteria. Other examples would be putting something in the refrigerator or in the freezer that's using temperature as a control factor to keep our food fresh. Oxygen is another control factor. Some microbes need oxygen to live, and they're called aerobic. And then some microbes can live without oxygen, and they are called anaerobic. And moisture. So moisture, most microorganisms, most organisms in general need some kind of water, some kind of moisture to live or to metabolize. And so by removing all moisture or locking up moisture in that food product, whether it's drying it or using salt or sugar to lock up available moisture, is a way that we can do food preservation as well. And a lot of these different kind of control factors are come into play when we talk about pickling, because there's so many different ways to do pickling. There's a lot of ways to make pickles. For the sake of simplicity in this class, I'm kind of grouping them into 3 large categories. When I say pickle, I think in American culture, when we say pickle, very often we mean a cucumber pickle, but there are lots of other vegetables that can be pickled, meat can be pickled, fruits can be pickled. There are other foods that we may not necessarily think of as a pickle, but are pickled. And I think in almost every traditional food culture, there's some kind of pickled or fermented vegetable or food. And so I think of like kimchi or sauerkraut or chutneys or cha-cha, like all of those I consider to be pickles. Anytime you're taking a fresh food and then using acidity to change its flavor and also keep it for longer term, I would consider that a pickle. And depending on how you make pickles, there are a lot of health benefits to it as well. Aside from just being able to have access to your food for longer, taking that fresh cucumber and making it into a product that you can either keep on the shelf, in the refrigerator, or in the cellar, for a longer period of time. We also, because the process of adding spices and vinegar or acidity in some way changes the flavor, it's something that very often these like pickles are foods that like remind us of our culture or taste like home. Some of them can be very strong flavors, but I like to think of pickles as very cultural foods. And they're going to add a lot of like interest and zest to the meals that you make on a daily basis. So the 3 main large groupings of categories that I'm putting my pickles into for the sake of today is refrigerator pickles, which are pickles that you make very quickly for now. And you could even like if you're making pickled onions, you could slice them up really thin, pour a little vinegar brine over them, keep them in a bowl, and have them ready for dinner tonight. But basically, with a simple fridge pickle, what I'm thinking of is something we're not canning it. We're using vinegar and the refrigerator to store the food and to preserve it for longer. And I think it's the easiest. I also think it's the safest. And you can play around with flavors and acidity levels because the refrigerator is doing a lot of the preservation. Another large category are pickles that are canned. And this means that you're taking the food and you're putting it in a jar, and then you're processing it in a boiling water bath canner. And this is heat processing a food in a jar so that it can be shelf stable. And the key to doing this is that you want to make sure that you're using a safe recipe that's specifically meant for canning. It's going to have a higher acidity level. And so then, a refrigerator pickle. And so we want to make sure that we're using safe protocols and safe recipes for that. And then the third kind of major category for me is fermentation. And what this means is we're taking our fresh food item and we're covering it not with vinegar, but with actually a saline solution, so salt brine, also herbs and spices. And we're encouraging, instead of using vinegar or something high acidity to curb any bacterial growth, what we're doing is encouraging lactobacillus bacteria, very specialized bacteria, to eat the sugars that are in the cucumber or the green bean or whatever is we're fermenting, the cabbage, and turn the sugars into lactic acid, which makes it sour. And so something like traditionally made sauerkraut or kimchi, or like if you eat like Bubby's or Brits pickles, those are fermented pickles. And so they have like a slightly different flavor. They're still going to be sour, but they might have a little bit more funkiness. So those are my basic, like 3 general groupings of, and I'm just going to go a little bit more detail into these, but I might have already said all these things. Let's see. Yeah, like I said, fridge pickles, they are the easiest and the safest. So I think this is like, if you've never made a pickle before, if you've never done any canning before, if you haven't done any fermentation, I think that just making fridge pickles is a really great place to get started. The general ingredients are going to be whatever vegetable you want to pickle, salt, and salt is not necessarily here for the preservation aspect. It's going to be just a very small amount of salt. But what that salt does is it's for flavor, and also helps to pull a little bit of moisture out of the vegetables, helps to keep them crispy. Vinegar is going to be what adds the acidity to the pickle. You might also use like a lemon juice if you're making a small amount of a pickle, but if you're making like a jar of pickles, mostly we're going to be using vinegar. And you can use any kind of vinegar that you like. We're also going to be adding water, because if you put veggies into just straight vinegar, that's a really high level acidity. And so we can use water to kind of temper the acidity when we are kind of creating our recipe. And then all kinds of spices. When I think of like a traditional cucumber pickle, I think of garlic and dill and maybe mustard seeds. But all kinds of we use all kinds of spices. I've put lavender in and lemon peel in pickles before, any kind of thing that you like. And then sometimes sugar is used too, and that is also for flavoring. If you think of like a bread and butter pickle, or sometimes the sugar isn't enough to make things sweet, but just to kind of round out the flavor and kind of cut the acidity just a little bit, so you have like a kind of more dynamic flavor. And with fridge pickles, you can use any kind of jar you like. You can use any sort of non-reactive container. You could just make it in a bowl and eat it for dinner that night. With canned pickles, let's see. These are the canned pickles are maybe like a next step. This is when I would encourage you to do some practice with canning, and do a little bit more research on, if you have never done canning before, I would encourage you to go to, this is a really great website, the National Center for Home Food Preservation. You can learn how to can, you can learn the process, and you can find a whole bunch of recipes that are safe for water bath canning. You're going to need special equipment for canning pickles. You're going to need obviously a canner, water bath canner. You'll use a jar with a 2-piece lid, a special canning jar. And also you're going to want to make sure that the vinegar that you're using for these canning recipes are specifically a 5% or more acidity vinegar. And a lot of your like regular, this is just like regular white vinegar that I bought, apple cider vinegar, a lot of those are going to be 5% acidity. You just want to make sure that it'll say it in the ingredients. Like this says, organic distilled vinegar diluted with water to 5% acidity. So know that if you're following a canning recipe for a canned pickle, it's going to specifically be asking for 5% acidity vinegar. So just keep an eye out for that. Yeah. And let's see, we'll go to the next. And then with fermentation, I feel like fermentation is kind of another, maybe not a step beyond canning, maybe a step in a different direction. But if you haven't done any fermentation before, I think it's a really fun thing to do. I like to do fermentation in a lot of different ways. I've got a lot of like kind of funky jars hanging out on the counter with kombucha and vinegar and dill pickles and kimchi and like all kinds of things sort of bubbling in my little like science corner. But this idea is that we're not, as opposed to canning, where we're really like killing or trying to control all like kill off all of the bacteria, molds, or yeasts. What we're actually doing is encouraging specific bacteria, which are lactobacillus species, and some others as well. There's usually kind of like an ecosystem that happens in there, but it can take a little bit of practice. Special equipment that you're going to need is some kind of straight-sided container. I do a lot of mine in just glass jars. Also, you can purchase these like thick-walled ceramic crocks that are made specifically for fermenting sauerkraut or like barrel pickles or making miso, that are kind of specifically for that. But this is going to require you to keep, there usually will be some kind of plate or weight on top, because you're going to have vegetables and your salt and vegetables and your like herbs and spices, and then you're going to mix up a salty brine. Fermentation usually doesn't have any prepared vinegar in it. Usually the sourness comes from the lactic acid fermentation. So we are going to, put our veggies and our spices and whatever we want to pickle in the jar or the crock, and we're going to pour a salty brine over it, and then we're going to use a plate or a weight to weigh the vegetables underneath the brine level. And what that does is it keeps those vegetables from molding while they're going through that process of being pickled. And if you think about something like kimchi or sauerkraut or barrel pickles, these are like ways that traditionally that folks have taken like a summer harvest and kept it usable all the way through the winter. So, there'll be like at the beginning of the fall, after you make the sauerkraut, it'll be like kind of mild tasting. And then as it stores through the winter, it'll get more and more sour, and then eventually be really sour, and like that, you make soup with it. But yeah, okay. So we can talk more about that too if people have questions. I'm just kind of going through these things really briefly to give you overarching look at. And then another category, I know I said 3, but I'm adding a 4th, would be like chutneys and relishes. And these are kind of usually chopped up in more of like a spooned condiment. And usually you would use a small amount, and that they would have very strong flavors. So they might be sweet and sour and spicy and salty. And you can find canning recipes to make chutneys and relishes. You can find also fermented recipes, and you can find just kind of like a quick, just like chop it up and put it in a blender, like a mint chutney or a cilantro chutney would be something that you would just make really quickly and then have for supper that night. So the chutneys and the relishes, they also kind of follow those same kind of 3 bigger general groupings of, you can make it quick to eat tonight or keep in the refrigerator. You could can it. And again, if you're going to can a chutney or a relish, you want to find a recipe that's meant for canning, or there are lots of recipes out there for fermented chutneys and relishes too. Yeah, and let's see, I think that might be my last slide. I have also some resources, and a lot of these resources are for canning. So if you haven't done canning before, if you weren't at my canning class a couple of weeks ago, really good like resources that I usually like to share to learn about canning are the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And this link, this is the website is hosted by the University of Georgia Extension, but they're the ones that do all of the testing, and these are the official guidelines of the USDA. And then also they publish a book and a DVD series called So Easy to Preserve. So you can learn more about canning and other types of food preservation through that. Ball Blue Books will also have recipes like your pretty standard, like dilly beans, cucumber pickles, pickled beets, those types of typical American things you'll find in the Ball Blue Book. And if you're going online to find a canning recipe, I would add whatever your Google search is going to be. Like I want to find like like a sweet pickle relish, like a canning recipe. Add cooperative extension to the end of your Google search, because that will take you to websites that have science-based recipes. So they're recipes that have been tested for safety. I also like to recommend, if you're interested in canning, Marissa McClellan's blog Food in Jars is a really good blog. And she's written a bunch of books as well. If you're interested in learning more about fermentation, there are lots more resources out there than there were when I started doing it about 10, 15 years ago. Wild Fermentation is a book by Sandor Katz, and it has been around for a really long time. And it's sort of a really great primer for just learning about fermentation, how it works. It's got recipes in there, everything from kimchi to sourdough to making mead. And he's written a few more books after that since. But there's also a lot of other books about making fermented vegetables and sauerkrauts and kimchis and relishes and that sort of thing. If you were to just look out there, there's a woman named Kirsten Shockey that's written a few books that are really good too. Yeah, and if you're looking for local places to get, canning supplies, McClendon's actually, they do sell, I like to recommend them. They sell a lot of food preservation equipment and supplies, and they do also sell those thick-walled fermenting crocks. And I haven't been there recently to look for crocks, but I feel like a few years ago I was there looking at crocks, and they even had like a big, like a 10-gallon crock that was very expensive but very exciting. And so you can, if you're looking for something like that, that's a good local place to go. If you want to mail order, let's see, Lehman's, Lehman, is a good online company for that kind of thing too. And I think that's the end of my slides. So I'm going to stop my share. And
I think there's like a kimchi version for all kinds of different cultures around the world, like the sauerkraut, or like there's a Salvadorian side dish that's just delicious. That's cabbage and carrots and onions. And I just think that that's fascinating and the ubiquitous of, no matter where we were as a society, we have pickling as part of it. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's cool too. And yeah, and I think that sour and sweet and sour flavors and salty and sour flavors and salty and sour and spicy flavors, like I think that's like a lot of folks are drawn to those because they are like kind of, like they help your digestive system get fired up. And so they've kind of always been those like salty, sour, spicy flavors have kind of been part of our traditional foods for a long time because they do help our digestive system.
There was this stuff called chow chow my grandmother from North Carolina would make, and it was spicier than kimchi in my opinion, but she loved it and just put it on everything.
Was it sweet too?
It could be sweet. She would add beans to it sometimes and serve it as a side dish, but sometimes it would just be, she would just have it after dinner in a little bowl and her little digestive.
Yeah. Cool. So I think I need like just a minute or two to move my camera back and bring my cutting board over to do my demo. And so maybe
there was just a couple questions about cucumber fridge pickles, how long they would keep in the fridge. And then I think there was like a water ratio question too, but that might be on a case by case basis for your recipe.
Yeah. I just put some ear things in because I'm going to move my computer back and I want to make sure you can still hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So I'm going to just move this back. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to, sorry, should I turn? Oh, okay. So I'm just going
Carrie,
to.
why don't I talk about the upcoming classes while you get set up?
Excellent. That's a great idea.
So as we mentioned earlier, this class is part of our 4-part food preservation series. The first class was on canning. We have a recording of that class on Facebook currently. So if you go to the City of Federal Way Facebook page or the South King Tool Library Facebook page and go to events, select the canning class, and in the discussion will be the link. Our 2 classes coming up are Intro to Food Dehydrating on June 10th and Bitters, Infusions, and Stocks on June 24th. So these will be in a very similar format. We have different speakers for each one. On the food dehydrating, we will be talking about freeze drying, and on the bitters, infusions, and stocks for Federal Way residents, you can pick up a free kit so you can make your own supplies. So when you register for that, next week we'll be sending out information about how to pick up those kits. So to register, you can email me at recycle@cityoffederalway.com. If you don't want to pre-register, you can always go to the event and we'll post the Zoom link about 1 to 2 days before the class. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie. Thank you, everyone.
All right. I think push this a little bit further back. You can see I raised my board up here, so hopefully can you see it? So I'm going to make just a quart-sized jar of pickles, and this is the same method that I've given you in the handout, and that method is based on my grandmother's pickled onion recipe. And so I use this basic method of like filling a jar with vegetables, putting in whatever spices I want. I do like 2 teaspoons to a tablespoon of salt. You can add a little bit of sugar in there if you like, and then I'll do 1 part vinegar to 2 parts water and shake it up, put in the back of the fridge. And I think that like I do it with all kinds of vegetables. I do it especially in the garden. Sometimes you have just like a handful of green beans and a handful of snap peas, and it might be, if you can imagine when you get to the point in the summer where you're tired of eating snap peas fresh and you're like, I just want to, like, I know I'm going to want to eat these later, but I can't eat another snap pea right now. And so it's a nice way to kind of put the pause button on your produce just for a little bit if you've got some extra space in the back of your fridge, and just make up a jar of pickles and then forget about it. And then when you come back to it in a couple weeks, in a couple months, you're like, oh, those snap peas, yay. And then you end up with some pickled snap peas. You're really excited about it. But since it's not the middle of summer and the only vegetables coming out of the garden right now are leafy greens for me, I decided to buy some produce, and I'm actually going to make my actual grandmother's pickled onion recipe. So I've got some onions, I've got some jalapenos, and I went to the Asian market and bought this. My grandmother lived in Hawaii, so we had this, which is a squash called chayote. And so that's what I'm going to put in my pickles. And so I'm taking this jar and I'm just going to fill it with vegetables cut in the size and shape of a vegetable that I like. So I've got my onion and I'm going to wedge it so it keeps together. I leave a little bit of the root end on so that the wedge stays together. And I'm just going to pack it in there. While I'm doing this, I could probably also answer some questions. Can you all see what I'm doing? Is this even like interesting or fun for you to watch me do this?
I love it. It's great.
And so I'm being kind of thoughtful about how I'm packing them in because I want to make sure I can cram as much stuff in there as possible.
Do you use pickling lime in canning for anything other than green beans or pickles, cucumbers?
I have not used pickling lime at all, actually. I've used other things to try to keep my pickles crispy, but yeah, I've not actually ever used pickling lime. I do know that you have to be careful because it's lime, it's going to change the acidity. And so however you use it, you have to make sure that you rinse it off really well so that it doesn't mess up the acidity of your pickle. So if you are going to be using lime, make sure that you're using a recipe that calls for it, and just make sure that you're following the guidelines for how that's used so it doesn't change the acidity of your pickle. So I just peeled the chayote squash and I'm going to cut it into chunks. And if you want to, Jeanette or Amanda, I think I could answer some questions while I'm doing this.
Okay, great. One person asked about garlic. She said she heard you aren't supposed to leave garlic in canned items. Is that true or not true?
I have not ever heard that before. I know that if you're pickling, or if you're canning tomatoes or some other thing that's not a pickle and you add garlic to it, you're going to be changing the pH of your canned product. And so that might be something that you'd want to be careful with. But if it's a pickle recipe, it probably will call for garlic, and I would leave it in there. Yeah. Okay. One thing that might happen is sometimes if you're using fresh garlic, like garlic you just pulled out of the garden, it might turn blue. And that's a weird chemical reaction that happens. I'm not quite sure why. It might also happen if you're using like some kind of reactive metal to cook up your brine. But those are the only two garlic things that come to mind for me when I'm.
Okay, so next question is, what is the vinegar to water ratio for fridge pickling?
For fridge pickling, that's a great question. And honestly, because the refrigerator is doing most of your preservation, the vinegar to water ratio can be whatever you want. With canning, the vinegar to water ratio is going to be at least 1:1. But like with this recipe that I'm making, it's 1 part vinegar to 2 parts water. So it's it's going to be a lot milder than like a canned, if I did a canned pickle, because I'm using more water to vinegar in my ratio. And that's for me the big difference between a refrigerator pickle and a canned pickle is that with the refrigerator pickle, you're able to adjust the acidity to your liking, because the refrigerator is doing the preservation for you and not the acidity.
So following up on fridge pickles, how long do cucumber fridge pickles last?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it sort of depends on what kind of cucumber you use. I think I would use a pickling cucumber if possible, because they're going to stay crispy longer. So with refrigerator pickles, they'll be like edible and safe to eat for a very, very long time. But often what happens is over weeks or months or years, if you have them that long, the texture of the vegetable is going to break down. And with cucumbers, I find that it happens very quickly. And mostly it's because we're very concerned, like cucumbers have like a very specific crunch that we expect. And so if that starts to deteriorate even a little, we are going to notice it quite a bit. But something like these pickled onions, I've had a jar in the back of my refrigerator for like 6 months, 9 months, and they're so good and they're so delicious. If that makes any sense. So cucumbers, people tend to be very particular about, and so the texture might deteriorate a little, but for the most part, they'll still be tasty. Okay, so I don't know if you can tell what I'm doing, but I'm just trying to get all of my pieces into the jar, trying to get as many in there as I can. So it's just a combination. And I think in the recipe that I gave you, or the method that I gave you in the handout, I was like, add your vegetables to the jar, add your spices. And probably suggested spices like garlic and dill and red pepper flakes. I'm not going to put any of that in this. I've got jalapenos for spice, and let's see. I like to use these like regular mouth jars because I feel like the shoulder helps to hold things in. I'm just going to cram as much as I can in there. I'm going to put 2 teaspoons to a tablespoon of salt. And again, this is going to help with the crispiness because it's going to help pull the water out. But this isn't necessarily for preservation. It's mostly for flavor. Let's see, so I've got my salt in there. If you wanted to put a little bit, I think the recipe also that I gave you calls for like 1 to 2 teaspoons of sugar. And that's not enough sugar to make it sweet like a sweet pickle. It's enough sugar to just kind of round out the flavor and give it like a little bit more depth. And then I often use apple cider vinegar in my pickles in a lot of things in life. I often use apple cider vinegar because we live in apple country. But for these, because this is my grandmother's recipe, I'm following her recipe. She just used straight up white vinegar. So my method is 1 part vinegar to 2 parts water. And again, because I'm not worried about the safety of this, I'm just going to eyeball measure. So I'll like put my finger here, and then all right, that looks right to me. Gonna add some water. And so for a lot of quick pickling recipes like this, where you're not canning them, you're just doing a vinegar brine, a lot of them will tell you to heat up the brine and sometimes even like simmer the spices in the brine and then pour them over. And that will help the pickle happen faster. So if you were like if you wanted pickled onions to like, put on your tuna sandwich for dinner tonight, I would not do this method. I would slice my onions very thin. I would heat up maybe a stronger brine, pour it over, put a plate or something on it to kind of keep the onions under that liquid, and let it sit there for 3-4 hours. And you have a really great pickle. This is a method that I use to like, to kind of put a hold on some produce, like that handful of green beans or the way too many snap peas or whatever coming out of the garden. So I'm not urgent to eat this right now. This is like a preservation technique for me. So what I do is I'll shake it up and I'll label it. I put a plastic lid on it, and that I think helps in the long term. If you put like a metal like canning jar lid on there, I would recommend putting a piece of wax paper, a piece of parchment paper in between, because that vinegar acidity will eventually start to deteriorate that metal lid. So if you have plastic lids, those are really nice to use. I'll shake this up, I'll label it, and I'll put it in the back of my fridge, and it'll start tasting delicious like pickles in maybe 3-4 days. It'll taste really good in a week, and then it'll last for a really long time. So that was my simple my grandmother's pickle recipe, but you can use it for pickling whatever you like. And I am happy to answer all of the questions that you have. I don't know how many more questions are out there.
So do you have a good recipe for pickled garlic scraps?
Scapes?
Sorry, my bad. Autocorrect. Yes.
Pickled garlic scapes. I don't know that I have a canning recipe for it, but I think that you could do something like this. I think that I have used like a dilly bean canning recipe and just exchanged the beans for the garlic scapes, but in a canned recipe, I think that would work. But you want to make sure that vinegar brine is a high acidity brine for canning recipe. The one thing that I've noticed, and maybe this isn't necessarily for garlic scapes, but for garlic scapes, for green beans, for carrots, if I'm doing it this is like a cold pickle. Like I'm not adding any heat to this. The texture is going to be different than like a canned pickle. So if I just put green beans in here and did it this way, it would be a different texture than if I had like eaten like dilly beans that were canned, or like from pickled beans that you buy in the grocery store. Has a different texture because the canned will have be processed with heat. So one thing is, if you wanted to make a fresh pickle recipe like this, but have that same sort of like slightly softer bite, which you might want with a green bean or a carrot or a garlic scape, you might just like steam blanch or the vegetables really quickly first, so it has a little bit of a softer bite. Or you could poach the vegetables for a short amount of time in, like you could heat up the brine and poach the vegetables in there for just a little bit first if you'd like to. So I think about like a pickled carrot, like the kind that you get at the taco truck. You know what I'm talking about? It's like they're like pickled. It's like carrots that have been pickled in like the jalapeno juice, and it's a softer bite. And so I think that they're just like cooked a little bit first. And I would probably do the same thing with my garlic scapes, just so it has a little bit of a softer bite.
And the surface area too, right? Like, so like using the, I know I have a recipe that really thin sliced cucumbers and very thin sliced pickles. And that's like good barbecue that night kind of stuff. So I love that. Lots of love for all kinds of different pickles in the chat, by the way. We were going over our favorite pickled pig's feet and pickled eggs, and shout out for the
yeah. And I mean, and it's the same thing too with even with canned like pickled beets. You know, there's a big difference. So most pickled beet recipes, and I think most pickled beets that we like have purchased or are used to eating, like old-fashioned recipes, the beets are soft and they're cooked. And so that's just like a thing to know, and it'll probably tell you to do that in your recipe. But like if you're doing a canned recipe and you're following the recipe for pickled beets, they're going to tell you to cook the beets first. And we may not necessarily think about that. Where like if you're just like pouring a vinegar brine over a bunch of sliced beets, like it's going to have a very different mouthfeel. It's going to have a very different. It's going to be hard and crunchy. So I would like cook those beets first and then do the pickling with them.
So we have a couple questions on keeping cucumbers crisp and crunchy. One person said, I heard you can put a raspberry leaf in sauerkraut. Somebody else talked about adding bay leaves. So, or is there a special kind of cucumber? Can you talk a little bit more about keeping those crunchy?
Yeah, there is a special kind of cucumber. It's called a pickling cucumber, and they're different than slicing cucumbers. I think they're not as easy to get because, like now in the grocery store, you can go to the grocery store and buy slicing cucumbers like now. You can buy them in January, you can buy them any time of year. But with pickling cucumbers, you got to either grow them in your backyard or go to like a special farmer's market or like Carpenitos or like somebody like the farm stand when it's pickling cucumber season, and then you buy up all the pickling cucumbers and you put up all your cucumber pickles. Like it's a seasonal delight. But the difference is that like slicing cucumbers, when you eat them fresh and in salads, you'll notice that they're very juicy and like crispy. And they have a different texture. Pickling cucumbers are actually like have a lot less water in them, and they're more solid and like crunchy as opposed to crispy. I don't know if that makes it, but they're like, it's a different texture, and they're just a slightly different kind of cucumber that is meant to hold that crunch. So making sure that you are pickling cucumbers is my first tip for making the crispiest or the crunchiest cucumber pickles. Another tip is I slice off about 1/16 of an inch from the blossom end before I do my pickling, and there's like an enzyme in the flower end that will soften, and like it's a ripening enzyme that will eventually like kind of like soften and break down. And so if you slice that off, it kind of keeps that softening enzyme from going further into the cucumber. I also choose the small ones And then if you're doing a canned pickle, there's a way where instead of doing a boiling water bath, you're actually doing, they call it pasteurization, where you're keeping the temperature at like 180 degrees and you keep it in that water bath for a certain amount of time. So it's like a lower temperature at a longer period as opposed to a high temperature for a shorter period. So if you were to look on like the National Center for Home Food Preservation, if you looked up for like pasteurization method for pickling cucumbers, for canning pickled cucumbers, that might help too. I've never done it. Normally I get by with choosing pickling cucumbers, picking the small ones, cutting off the blossom end. And then I normally will put like a grape leaf in there because the tannins will help to firm it up. There's also a product called Pickle Crisp, I think, and it's like calcium chloride, and that has a firming agent. So people use that also. But yeah, there's and everybody's got everyone's got their full remedy for keeping things crispy. But
thanks so much. So on refrigerator pickles, is it okay if the onions turn pink? And if not, how do we prevent that?
Yeah, I try to think of why an onion would turn pink other than if it was a red onion to start out with. The purple or red of the skin is going to mix with the white layer and then also bleed out into your brine. So if you're starting with a purple or red onion, then yes, of course it's going to turn pink. That's totally normal. If it's a yellow onion and you're using, or white onion and you're using white vinegar and no pink colored spices, I don't know why it would turn pink. But if you're using something like apple cider vinegar that already has a colored tinge to it, it might
Could a peppercorn do that? Could like a rogue pink peppercorn?
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
That might do it too.
Okay, so another question is, this person's never made pickles before. How would you cut them? Do you do them the same as you do the onion in the video?
Yeah, I think if you're doing cucumber pickles, and you get to decide if you want to, like, again, I like to choose the little ones because I think they're the crunchiest. I'm the lady at the farmer's market that's like in the bin, like sorting through all the ones and just picking out the ones that I want because I like the little ones. So I like to do whole little ones. If you want to like slice them once the long way, just have them, or you can quarter them the long way, or you could even like slice them into like thicker chips. The thing is, the smaller the piece and the more like inside of the pickle that you expose, it's going to pickle faster, but also would eventually on the back end would, will get softer quicker as well. So if you want it to happen fast, I would cut it small. And even like Amanda said, if you wanted to like have it for dinner that night, like slicing them really thin, because it's going to be able, like you're opening up a lot of surface area. It's going to be able to absorb a lot of flavor, a lot of the vinegar and a lot of the spices. But if you want it to last a long, long time, I would leave it whole.
Great. So another question on the fridge pickles. Can you reuse the brine? So example, if you make your brine and you eat your pickle and you put fresh in there every day and you can just keep using that, and any recommendations on how long?
Yeah. Yeah. So the answer is yes, probably. And I don't know how long, but here are the factors that I'm thinking about. When you put a vegetable in there, that vegetable is going to be absorbing some salt and absorbing the vinegar and absorbing the flavor from the spices. So every vegetable that you put in there and every pickle that you take out is going to be removing, like every pickle that you pull out of the jar is going to be removing vinegar, salt, and spices. So if you want to continue reusing that brine for a long period of time, I would add more vinegar, I would add more spices, I would add a little bit more salt with the new vegetables as you add them in.
Could they also like heat that too? I know that was part of my quick pickle recipe, was heating the, like you were saying, to just for safety's sake, I mean, I guess there's not really going to be any bacteria that's going to be able to grow in there unless it's growing on the actual vegetable, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you could definitely heat the brine. I think I would also add a little bit more vinegar because that's the thing, right? Is like the vinegar is also helping to delay bacterial growth. So the less acidity you have, at some point you're just going to have like a cucumber in a jar of water. Not really, but like the acidity level is going to go, you know, it's going to be less and less acidic. And so, yeah, there's more and more potential for mold to grow. I think another thing that I like to encourage people to do to keep the length, of their pickles longer, is to make sure that like the vegetables are in the brine, that they're not sticking up out of the brine, because anything sticking up could potentially grow mold that's sticking out of the brine. And also, don't go in there with your dirty fingers, like, or the fork that you just ate dinner with. Like, clean fork, clean tongs, clean chopsticks, to go into the jar. Because if you're sticking your fingers in there, if you're sticking in like the fork that you just like you eat the pickle and then you put the fork back in, that's just bacteria that you're adding to the jar. So, you know, just
Tell my kids, they don't listen.
yeah. Always a clean fork.
Wonderful. So question on fermentation. Where's a good place to learn how to do a sweeter fermentation?
It's a good question. So the sweeter fermentations are a little bit tough because the more sugar, like you're not necessarily thinking of adding sugar on the front end. The higher sugar content your fermentation has, the more likely you're going to be growing yeast instead of lactobacillus. And so you'll end up, like if you do like a fruit fermentation, you end up with something boozy because it's high sugar, right? And so sometimes, like with kimchi, sometimes folks will add like a grated up like Asian pear, and it adds a little bit of sweetness, but not too much. So you could add a little bit of fruit, but I don't often see fermented pickles that are on the sweeter end unless you let the fermentation go and then you sweeten it up on the back end and pack it into the fridge, because that's going to slow down fermentation. Because the more sugar or sweetener you add at the beginning of the fermentation, the more likely you're going to get yeast growth instead of bacteria.
Great. I've got two more questions. Is now the time to buy the pickling cucumbers, or when should people start looking for them at the farmer's market?
Yeah, pickling cucumbers come out like mid-summer, like end of July is when I'm looking for them. So it's not for a while. Yeah, it's not for a while. Sorry.
Okay, and the final question, which is my favorite, we've been talking in the chat. What's the weirdest pickled thing you've ever had? So everybody's been responding. So how about for you, Carrie? What's your weirdest pickle?
I mean, is it cliche to say pickled fish? Like, I've definitely eaten lots of different kinds of, or tried lots of different kinds of pickled herring when I was on like a ferry between Norway and somewhere up in the land of the smorgasbord. I did eat a lot of pickled different, like the smorgasbord was just like 8 different kinds of pickled herring, as I remember. It seemed like a lot. Not my cup of tea, but I ate other kinds of fish. I'm curious what other answers came up. Weird pickle things.
So I started the question antagonizing me. I was curious. I love pickled things, but definitely I was surprised nobody said lutefisk, because the big Norwegian population up here. But I like pickled crab, and I can't remember where I had that in my travels. And anybody's welcome to unmute if they'd like to share their weird pickle affinities. But I think the eggs, we didn't even think of carrots initially, because that's just standard. Everybody has that with tacos. It's amazing. Jeanette, I'm not back there right now. Back up. Oh, pig's feet, of course, pickled pig's feet and tongue and.
Well, I think this is a good point to turn off the recording. So I'm just wanted to thank Carrie again from Tilth Alliance for sharing your evening with us, and for Amanda Miller from the South King Tool Library. Again, we will be posting this on YouTube, but stay connected with us on Facebook at the City of Federal Way or South King Tools. And then we're posting all of our classes that we have at www.cityoffederalway.com/green living. So all our green living classes will be on there. And I'm going to stop the recording and then we can chat some more.